And what I've done is, to kick off the discussion, I've asked each person on the panel to give us an example of a model city that's in a developing country, for them to tell us why that city is a model and somewhere that maybe we could all learn from. In my research into this topic beforehand, I talked to some very good experts, and I did some cramming research, some homework before I came. And we sort of identified, in my research, identified 4 key elements to what makes a good city. What are the kind of benchmarks? And one is, how do you power the city? So what is the kind of sustainable energy practices that are used in the city, and how does that contribute to making it a livable place? Transportation, obviously, is important. More and more we see the sharing economy when it comes to transportation, but also traditional public transport. Land use, how is the land used? What is the density of the city, and how successful is the city based on that? And then diversification of the economy, but more broadly of society, and how diverse is your city? These are all factors that I think benchmarks for how successful a city can be. And so I'm going to ask each person to tell us their city, and to get things kicked off, and to tell us why they've chosen this city. So maybe Fred, we'll start with you, since you're sitting next to me.
All right, well, thank you. I think I'd be hard-pressed not to choose Dubai. I've been traveling there since 1994 and living there with my family for the last 10 years. How many people have been to Dubai? Okay, so it's, and the reason I chose it, to make obviously a long story short, is you have in that city just an absolutely incredible visionary leadership. And nothing destined that pile of sand to become the global hub that it is now. You have a number of assets that are really helping to build that city into what it is today, notably an airline, Emirates Airline, that travels all around the world. You can reach more destinations to India from Dubai than you can from any airport in India itself, to give you an example. You have the port of Jebel Ali, which is in the top 5 ports in the world in terms of container movements. You have a complete open, welcoming society of wanting to attract the best of talent internationally in order to learn and in order to provide the right entrepreneurial ecosystem in that city. You have the rule of law, which is based on best practices. The Dubai Financial Services Center is all legislated under DFSA law, which is based on the UK code, and so on and so forth. Technology. It's been 5-7 years now that I've been entering and coming out of that airport using my fingerprint. And it's only about a year ago that, as I come here on my ESTA visa, that I'm able to, here in these airports, put my fingerprints and do the same. That's been the case for the last 6-7 years. But I think the final point I would make is why I'm choosing it as a model city is that it is also based geopolitically, geostrategically, in the middle of a very huge region where there is a growing middle class between India, Pakistan, Iran, and the rest of the Gulf. You have an incredible rising surge of consumption and middle class, where Dubai is just perfectly well centered to be able to act as the transit hub commercially, financially, and without even talking about the tourism industry.
Good, thank you. Professor Yuan?
Well, I told Jamil, can I have 2 that kind of choices? Only one. Then I would say...
You can have 2.
Well, I was hesitating in the morning. I told Jamil yesterday, I said, the first what came into my mind is Shanghai, my hometown, though I have spent almost more than 5 decades in Beijing, where I work, teach as a professor of the university. But I still think Shanghai maybe list on the top. Then I have some other name like Shenzhen. When I think about this model, I think especially the people there. And the people, it's just so in general terms, but think about generation upon generation, they make up this great city called Shanghai. People in Shanghai is very dynamic, pragmatic. At the starting point, period of open door reform about more than 30 years ago, I had some chance to talk with my friends around Chinese and the foreign investors, especially foreigner and Chinese too. Said, well, when we talk about a deal, business deal, with people in the north, especially northwest, northeast, no problem, no problem. But when we talk with people in Shanghai, well, a lot of problems are listed, 1, 2, 3, and got to talk very much in detail, and the people in Shanghai would remind those investors, here is some rules there, this is a regulation there. So finally, all these talked beforehand moved to much smoother process. So I keep on thinking the pragmatism of people in Shanghai. But I think the most important is the spirit saved by generations, that source of a sense of cosmopolitan sense, just very much open to the world. Always try to learn something. It's almost started from the very beginning, the city, 100 years ago. So that's a cosmopolitanism. This is so important, and I think it will lead to the future as some sort of a guideline.
Yeah, I agree with you that Shanghai is definitely the most cosmopolitan city in China. And if there's any place that you could say was like an immigrant community within China, it would be Shanghai.
Diversity,
which,
yes.
as we know from the US, is a great driving force of innovation. So
I agree.
yeah. So, please.
So thanks. I had a tough time with this because I don't think of any one city that's a good model for every dimension of being a great global city. But my choice would be Rio. And Rio, to me, faces so many challenges, so it makes it very real. I think Dubai has enjoyed maybe the most audacious and successful development program the world has ever seen, but it was really developed, you know, in medical terms, it's like in vitro. It was like a laboratory experiment. Clean sheet of paper, create your own governance system, create your own grid, create your own everything from scratch pretty much. And that's magnificent to be able to do, but so many cities around the world don't have that opportunity. So Rio faces really real problems. They're space constrained, they have a significant wealth gap and skills gap in the city. So what I see in Rio is a real strong dedication to infrastructure, transportation in particular, albeit mostly mandated through preparations for the 2016 Olympics. Secondly, a very deliberate attempt to take the favelas, which have been really a source of serious security problems, as well as a sustaining of the wealth gap in the city, and turn them into a new vital asset for the city, mostly through, first of all, bringing them into the city economy, so breaking down the autonomy that existed. There's many police states that were the favelas, and then bringing people out of them into the workforce, which we as a company and others are really doing in a deliberate way. And the third is the use of data. There's a lot of discussion about data last night. Ajay Banga from MasterCard talked about how critical data was. They committed to maybe not quite the incredible data center that Dubai has for operating Dubai, but a very clearly a world-class data center that helps to actually operate the city. It's the coordination of about 24 different departments across the city. So I think in those three particular dimensions, and those three areas are three areas that most global cities are faced with, makes Rio a model, at least in those dimensions.
So the key takeaway is get the Olympics, and that will...
That'll propel you
Yeah.
to, right.
We know that in Beijing, obviously. So Rolf, please, your city.
Thank you very much. I very much agree with what Mark was saying. Difficult to take a model, and the question is, it's a very good experience, a good practice, but then for whom? So when I looked at the possible candidates for that, I will suggest a city in Indonesia. It's called Surabaya. It's about 3 million people. It's situated on the east of Java. And I will say, why did I choose this? Because I think it's a very interesting model for green policies. You know that most countries, I'm coming from the OECD, the 34 member countries are striving for being better in green cities, becoming better in green cities. And there is a country, Indonesia, which is currently a very, what we call a country with which the OECD would like to have very, very close relationships. So we have, over time, worked in many areas. When you look at Surabaya, there are 3 elements for a green approach. And interesting, because it was something that you can do elsewhere, you can replicate it. And that's a very important, an example that can actually work somewhere else. The first one was they had in the 2000s very heavy problems in terms of health and pollution, and very much related to waste, solid waste management, or better, the lack thereof, as an industrial city. So what they thought about was either develop a major system that would take care of it, or involve the local communities. And that's what actually was the way that they wanted to proceed. And very interesting, they said the communities have to collect the waste, but the city government will take care of it, of taking it out and dispose of it. The second point, they would dedicate a very specific 20% of the space of the city to green areas by fiat, by decision, 20%. It's quite a number. If you look in many countries, they would not, and cities, they would not come to that percentage. And the third thing they did, they created already very early on car-free zones. So it's a nice combination, and I think it shows where there is a will. Obviously, there is also a way to get there. And I thought of it when I talked to Jamil. I thought maybe Mayor Bloomberg in New York, when he dedicated Times Square to the pedestrians, maybe he passed through Surabaya.
Surabaya. So an example from Indonesia, those of us who travel to Jakarta wouldn't necessarily think of Indonesia as a first, as a global model, but that's interesting that I haven't been to Surabaya, so next time I will try to make it there. We were talking a little bit earlier about a topic that I find absolutely fascinating, which is comparing the political systems, the national political systems in a country, and the way that those affect the development of cities. So, and being based in China for so long, but traveling to India sometimes, often we will compare these two systems, where in China you can knock down a neighborhood and ignore the protests of the people who may be living there. So you get very fast development, but not necessarily with the buy-in of your population. Whereas in India, you have democracy constraints that stop you from being able to do that in quite the same way, but with a different outcome when it comes to how successful your infrastructure is. So I wondered if maybe each of the panelists, and I want to get a bit of a debate. I told them all they're not allowed to agree entirely with each other the whole time. I'm a journalist. I want to see some conflict, and so maybe I thought we could, each of you could, we could discuss this idea of the pros and cons and what you get from different, how national political systems affect the development of the city. So maybe Rolf, why don't we start with you?
Well, frankly, Jamil, I think there are many very direct links, I would say. But let me pick one which is close to my heart when we talk about cities. It's actually something that hasn't appeared here in the discussion during the last days, not so prominently, and that's how cities are governed. And it may be because we assume that we have the institutions and the capacity in place so that we don't need to worry about it. But I think that would be a major mistake not to look at it. And I would like to say in many cases, like in the United States, but in many countries of the OECD for sure, you have levels of government that do or do not cooperate very well when it comes to cities. And that's true also for many countries outside the OECD world. So when we talk about government of cities, I think one need really to look at it and say, are there the institutions that can exercise very important functions? Create space for people where they can do business, where they do get education, where they do get health, so that in the end there is a prosperity emerging in those cities. And I think one of the most important, probably nationwide policies that you would like to see is the rule of law. Mark said it. The rule of law, again, we very often take it for granted, of course. But it's not really true. And it's not just a question of the developing world and emerging cities. So when I think about what makes a city an attractive place for investors, for people who want to run a business, be they from the country itself, from the city itself, or from another country, people who want these public services, they will very much look to the fact whether or not the rule of law is a reality or just a fiction.
Sure. Maybe, Professor Yuan, maybe if I ask it in a slightly different way, how important is it to have the input of the wider communities, individuals in society? How important is that input to the development of successful cities, do you think?
Well, before I go directly to actually the point you mentioned, the difference between China and India, I want to make one point clear that these two ancient civilizations have been peacefully coexisted for thousands of years. And when Prime Minister Modi visited China 2 weeks ago, a little bit more, 20 days ago, he went to Xi'an, the ancient Chinese city, where the Buddhism actually was borrowed by one monk scholar, traveled all the way from Xi'an down to northern part of India. And imagine how hard it was for people to travel under that kind of a natural condition. So when Prime Minister Modi from India visited Xi'an, the ancient city, he and President Xi Jinping had quite nice talk with each other. And then I think two of them reached to some common grounds. We got to think about Oriental wisdom, how to solve problems instead of all those conflicts. But I do appreciate you mentioned that kind of difference, especially the land policy between China and India. That's quite something, especially the land policy at home. Because China, for the over 3 decades and more, developed, my view, too fast. And as Hank Paulson mentioned yesterday, the local government, they just selling the land and get money and push things forward. So, of course, it will invite some riots from the local people. And in China, for peasants, thousands of years, land almost mean everything for them, for individually, for the families, for generation. People would think, what I leave for my children? Land.
Yeah.
So with that kind of a mentality in mind, this is really something Chinese, got to pay enough attention, especially at this moment. I think quite a number of policies in concrete terms will come out. Try to learn from the past, the lessons actually. Maybe some, from our neighbors.
Hopefully. Yeah, please.
Maybe, you wanted us to be provocative. Maybe too much democracy sometimes is counter to development agendas and growth. I recall Turkey. And when President Özal died, in the mid-90s, after the man had opened up the country to privatization and to massive infrastructure investments, what followed for the next 10 years was a succession of impossible coalition governments where nothing can get through, no reforms could get passed because there was always never a majority and alignment behind a vision. And around 2004, the AK party, Islamic party of Mr. Erdogan was elected to power, full majority in the parliament, full ability to just take that country through a whole series of financial, economic, and social reforms. And Turkey has boomed over the last 10 years.
No one accuses him of too much democracy.
No, I know that in the media and there's one can look at it under that angle. I think the point I'm trying to make is national politics can have a massive impact, or can be positively, or actually be a paralysis to that situation.
Exactly. I think that was what I was trying to get at a little bit with the question, is that there is a trade-off. If you want to develop very fast and have wonderful, shining, high-speed rail, which, by the way, I'm a huge fan of in China. I think it's the best in the world. Wonderful. If you want to be able to build that, you need to have a strong central authoritarian system often to be able to get that through, to take the land without listening to the people who might be on it, and get things done.
A benevolent authoritarian system.
Benevolent authoritarian. By the way, just very quickly, what you said about too much democracy can be bad for development is not provocative in any way where I live or where Professor Yuan lives. That is the orthodoxy. But anyway,
I was just going to draw one specific example. So in China, when we're opening a hotel, we have to secure, depending on where exactly you are, about 20 different permits to open the hotel.
Yeah.
And in India, it's about 120.
Wow.
Depending on what jurisdiction you're in. So the differences are vast, and the impact is significant, building time and opening time. The one thing that I would just note, I'm not qualified to call this a mega trend at this point, and I think it's got a long way to go before it's mega. But an emerging trend for sure is that corruption is increasingly unpopular around the world. If you look at Xi Jinping's initiatives beginning in the fall of 2013 and the huge impact it had thereafter, and if you look at Prime Minister Modi's his leaning towards this. So Fred, to your point, if his party wins the upper house and they actually have a majority and they can move even more deliberately and more quickly, I think you'll see more anti-corruption coming out. In my chosen global city, Rio, Petrobras is going through a pretty torturous sort of truth and reconciliation in public of this mass corruption scandal, which will have huge implications. The good news is that I think the tolerance for this kind of behavior is waning fast, and it's waning fast. And I just named 3 of the fastest growing economies in the world. So I think this is good news. And in terms of setting a tone, creating the conditions, creating an environment for good, healthy growth, this is, I think, indispensable.
So the lesson you're bringing to Chicago is less corruption. Chicago.
Yeah, so it's not just in the emerging world. We have somehow a recent history of governors being the guests of the state of Illinois. So we have our own we have our own experience with that here. In
Sorry, Rolf, you wanted to say?
Yeah, just a comment. You know, when you ask, there is sort of how much participation should there be? That's what you're asking for, actually, no? And I think that the answer depends a bit on what are you talking about? If we talk today about cities, what's the great thing about most cities when they have a mayor? We heard this morning, an elected mayor in the case of London, but in other places the same thing. What's the big thing about it? Accountability. I mean, someone who takes decision has to stand up for scrutiny. I'm not talking about corruption. I'm just talking about the accountability.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is accountable.
Sure.
That the mayor has to actually take care of a multitude of interests. And that's perhaps what makes it complicated, but not the fact that someone is asking you, why did you do that? It's the question of that you have 10 people asking you, or a few more in Chicago, what are you doing? So I believe very much that that type of accountability is a very, very good thing.
Very
and
powerful.
most mayors, I'd say, are subject to that accountability. Why they perhaps also would like to be always re-elected.
In fact, in China, we've seen a move towards this accountability where the central government has tried to say, okay, this mayor, if you're in charge of this city, you will be the one who gets blamed. So even in non-democratic systems, you also
Absolutely.
see this. Yeah, that's a very important point. Can I get on to maybe business and the way that we have, public-private partnerships, this wonderful term. Good business practices are really essential to quality growth, lack of corruption. What are some of the ways in which companies, like your companies, are able to share and institutionalize good business practices? Maybe start with Mark.
I would say first and foremost, it's employment. One of the key things that we see, and this is true in most major cities, no matter whether you're in the developed world or emerging world, a significant skills gap, wage gap, and wealth gap that are widening. And so I think that companies enlisting the private sector to focus on employment, and especially employment of people who are coming out of disadvantaged areas or low-income areas, is absolutely essential. We have the benefit of being in an industry, the hospitality industry. The travel and tourism industry around the world represents roughly 10% of global GDP. About 275 to 280 million jobs, maybe 1 out of every 10 or 11 jobs in the world is in our industry. And one of the most amazing things about our industry is that so many of the entry-level positions don't require significant skills. So we can actually play a significant role in bringing people out of very disadvantaged areas or low-income backgrounds, giving them an initial position, providing them skills and support, and then allowing them to grow. And I think that's actually really essential to having, to putting the economy on a better track towards sharing the economic gains that will come from growth overall. And of course, over time, that also will have a positive impact on potential social unrest that comes from too much of a widening gap. So I think this is actually an essential point for all cities, especially in emerging markets, and something that I think business, the private sector, can and needs to. I would say we can and we need to play an ever increasing role in this. We have a Grand Hyatt hotel in Sao Paulo. And about 10% of our employees in that hotel come out of favelas and very low-income areas in Sao Paulo. I think we need to be talking about getting that number to 30%. in order to start to have an impact. And then I would say we need to then extend that across our industry and then other industries in order to really start to have an impact on this. And so I think that's actually a really important way in which we can play a positive role. And cities should actually be supporting that effort in a significant way, because the potential for social unrest from this widening wage gap over time can be damaging.
What happens though when they come to work in the Park Hyatt, but then they go back at night, or the Grand Hyatt, and they go back at night to the favela, and they have to? I mean,
it's a critical issue. And it's especially acute in China, because many of our employees in China are coming from different provinces, so they're actually displaced. So we've spent a lot of time actually identifying and securing housing. For example, in Dubai, we have the vast majority of our employee base, and when I say vast, I mean more than 95% of our employees are not Emirati. They are from, in fact, 44 different countries in Dubai. We have almost 5,000 employees in Dubai. We built a village, actually, a small compound for them to live in. This is actually quite essential. In Brazil, we've provided some support for allowing, providing some resources, things as simple as linens, towels, amenities, for people to actually be able to improve their standard of living, if you will, in their current circumstances. But in many cases, I'm proud to say that they've been able to put themselves on a track to actually move into more, commodious.
Not quite the Park Hyatt.
Not quite the Park Hyatt, but a very important step forward into a more secure area and better life.
Sure. Yep, I'll first Fred and then Professor Yuan.
I think we're living through momentous times where the role of business, particularly, everywhere, but particularly in these growth markets, you call them emerging markets, we call them growth markets, is changing and tremendous. And we have, over the next couple of months, we see governments are now more open to working with the private sector than ever before. And that means also city and municipalities are understanding that working with the private sector, and that this big mindset shift that profitability is not a bad word, is finally coming to the fore. And ahead of us, we have a massive opportunity with the Financing for Development Summit that's taking place in Addis, the Sustainable Development Goals that are going to be signed in New York by 180 heads of state in September, and the Climate Change Conference in Paris. And these mechanisms, for the first time, when you compare this to 20 years ago, have private sector engagement, because I think, again, authorities are understanding that we have a responsibility and we also have resources and know-how to make a difference on the ground. And when it comes to private equity, because that's what Abraaj is, we're a private equity investor focused on growth markets, we can have a tremendous, to answer your question, impact in terms of creating sustainable growth by particularly to the point that Rolf mentioned in cities before, but also in companies, which is in putting in the right systems of governance. Being able to help businesses that are growing fast, that are often started by an entrepreneur or owned by families, but helping them institutionalize that business to best practice. And also this whole way of looking at an investment, and I'm sure that Hyatt does that too, looking at it through the lens of the environment, looking at it through the lens of the social dimension, as you just mentioned, Mark, looking at it through the governance lenses. It's not just as a tick-the-box exercise, but really looking at how you can create long-term value by taking a long-term approach in these investments. Now, if I can, I'd just like to give you a quick example, because these are, just to sort of bring it to the ground. We invested in 2007 in Karachi, Pakistan, in the Karachi Electric Supply Company. It's the monopoly of electricity generation and distribution for one of the largest cities in the world. The company was completely broken down, completely corrupt. It was the most hated brand practically in the city of Karachi because of load shedding and because of employees were getting shot in the street when they were trying to either come and fix some lines or fighting against theft, because they all put their little hooks on the wires and the electricity is stolen in the neighborhoods. Lo and behold, to make a long story short, our investment strategy was first of all just eradicate the corruption inside of that company, to change the morale completely of these 11,000 employees in order to re-give them a passion for the company that they were serving and the city that they were serving ultimately. We then tackled the corruption on the outside. We did a survey to see who are not paying their bills to this company. And what we found out is that it was in fact the richest areas of the city who were not paying their bills. So what we did was to start doing a name and shame game in the local media and in the newspapers. Death threats, car explosions in our parking lots. I mean, we faced it all. But today, after having taken now this company since 2007 for a number of years into the communities as well, creating football leagues for the slums, for the kids, in order for them to stay out of trouble, we have now, since last year, started running a profitable company, and load shedding is down to a minimal, even though it's still an issue. And to take it one step further, and I'll stop there, there's, outside of Karachi, there's the largest cattle colony in the world. It's called Landi. And if you look at it from Google Earth, you will see this big brown area of cow dung that is just going into the sea every time the monsoon rains fall. And so what we're doing there, under the banner of this company with Canadian technology and the IFC, is we are preparing the largest biogas plant in the world outside of the city of Karachi. So business can have an incredible impact in terms of creating long-term, sustainable, and profitable impact in areas where there is massive inequality. So I just thought sharing that gives a bit, hopefully a bit of an illustration of what can be done at a large scale and at a small scale as well.
It makes me think, I'll let Professor Yuan say some things in a minute, but it makes me think of when I complain about living in Beijing, the things I complain about are the air, very polluted air, the traffic, the congestion, the poor service standards in the hotels. I'm sorry, even your hotel sometimes. Wonderful place, but
come on.
Better than most, I have to admit. I'm a guest, full disclosure, I'm a guest right now at the Park Hyatt, and it's wonderful, it's wonderful.
That's on the record.
That's on the record, yeah. Full disclosure. But what I would say is when I think about all those things that I'm complaining, I also, if I take a slight shift in my mindset, I think those are the business opportunities. These are amazing opportunities to, if you can raise service standards and create a really thriving service industry, training for hotels, hospitality, if you can fix the air. I mean, that China, by dint of being the most polluted place on earth, has to be the greatest opportunity for green technology in the world. Fixing the traffic through big data or the things Ajay was talking about yesterday. So I mean, I think there is a huge role for business, and it's more and more recognized. But Professor Yuan,
I just want to add some story to this. We call it corporate social responsibility. As a professor at the university, I really concerned about really the younger generation. They are going to be future leaders or backbone or whatever, and play more and more role in this very globalized world. And I remember, like 5 or 6 years ago, I went to Dubai, and I checked in the hotel and met a group of Chinese employee, young people. And I was astonished that from China, they said, yes, from Shandong province, because their school had some contract, maybe with your group, I don't know, I couldn't remember now. But anyway, very good training projects. And they try to learn not only language skills, but also how to make good service. And they gave me a lot of, I would say, teaching from their own very practical, lively stories, their experience. Very young, they're around 20 years old. So this kind of opportunities to learn abroad, especially think from China, worked in Dubai, and they are going back to China. So they brought up with a lot of, I would say, very rich experiences and learnings to teach the country folks. That's really something to me.
You mentioned the word corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, that's the word quite.
I hate that word.
Why?
I hate that word.
Why?
Because I think corporate social responsibility is dead. Now, in order for a business to thrive, you have to embed inside of your business model the way of creating long-term value. It's not about just having 2-3 people create a foundation or have 2-3 people with a corporate social responsibility program doing good, good philanthropy, if you want, or sometimes it can be PR. So I just wanted. He said before, you have to disagree with each other. So, but the
Respectfully disagree.
I'm being very respectful. But the point about getting, that business can have an impact on cities is of paramount importance because we are on a one-way ticket to become an urbanized humanity. A couple of years ago, for the first time, the human race became urbanized, and there's no going back. And there's 1 million people moving into cities every week into the cities of the growth markets where we're investing in. That's the equivalent of 8 New York cities every year. 8 every year. So it's going to, whether it's air, whether it's healthcare, whether it's congestion, whatever it is, there's a massive investment opportunity, but also a huge risk that if we don't get this right, we may be creating much bigger problems for ourselves in the future.
Rolf.
Just a comment on this relationship between private sector and the city government. Most countries, be they industrialized or developing these days, are very short on money. And at the same time, there's an incredible need. You said a need to provide services, build roads, invest in water management, you name it. And actually, most city governments have not even the choice to think that they could do it on their own. There are no means, and there is no technology management in government that would be able to solve these issues efficiently and with the necessary technological and technical knowledge. Therefore, I think the question is not really, is there a role? The question is, what kind of role will the private sector be able to take over? And if I may say, Frederic, I think I have seen in many of the countries outside the OECD world this not easy situation between private sector that has a really very nice offer to make, for example, water management in cities, which is a dramatic need, importance and the need, but also importance for health and so on. That they come with offers that, of course, say we want stability of the regulatory framework for 30 years. Or we want to make sure that we have our institutional setup, we're like the partners, the same ones. So there is a learning process, I think, between cities and city government and the private sector to make sure that this works. And one of the most critical issues is, how do we share the risk of these investments? Because they are risky. If you go for whatever that is, infrastructure, it's a long-term engagement. I mean, engagement physically nearly, that you have to deliver services, but also that you put money in and that you put your staff in and that the citizens expect that it works. I think, therefore, today, when you look at countries, if I may say again, Indonesia, an investment need of about $240 billion. No way that they will ever have money to pay for that. No way that official aid from countries would be sufficient to do this. So they have to cooperate. And I would think it would be good if private sector and these people in the cities find a good way to understand each other that there is a real risk sharing necessary, because in the end, it's the credibility of both government and the private sector to be in a real partnership. Credibility, very important, and very difficult to build, rebuild once you have lost it. If I may use one example, there's a large water company, globally operating, had a very important investment to make in Argentina. And they were supported by some international investment banks and so on. In the end, they couldn't agree on, once it was built, a few years later, they couldn't agree on the increase in water prices, the tariffs. There was no agreement to it. Disaster, because no understanding anymore. Government was not willing to move. The company didn't either. 10 years it took. Only very recently this question was settled in a court, of course. Unhappy, everybody. But what's the consequence? Of course, there is damage and all of that. But what's the consequence? I spoke to these people in the private sector. They said, to be honest, we would never again invest our own money in that kind of investment. We do the engineering, happily, right, but we will not put money up. So the costs are very important to look at. And the cost is not just financially, because the next time you will go around and you say, I need someone who builds my water system in the city, and they have that experience in mind, difficult to find a partner there. So there's a responsibility really on the government side as much on the private sector side. I'm sorry for being so long, but I think it's fine.
I have a small adjunct question to this topic. When I look around, every time I come to the US, I'm kind of struck by the fact, if you walk around, you'll see buildings and institutions named after individuals. So we were in the Pritzker Garden last night, I think, and I mean, you look around and there's names attached everywhere, and obviously that's a result of a very strong culture of philanthropy, where there have been shortfalls in maybe the government. Government maybe is bankrupt, some governments are. Not the private sector so much, but individuals will step up and fill the gap. And I wondered, it's surprising to me when I see it here, I do notice it. I wonder if there are examples in growth economies, emerging economies. Do you see it? I mean, in Dubai, maybe it's the royal family, but I mean, do you see it in other places where maybe Mark, where you're operating? Is it something that you have noticed in any other?
Mostly sovereign.
Sovereign.
Yeah. There's a $30 billion development in Jeddah, for example, and it's being done by the royal family.
The royal family,
So yes, I see it throughout the Arab world, and it's almost all the sovereign, either an instrumentality of the government or the family, the royal family itself.
What about in Latin America? Do you see it at all? I mean, is it something that...
Not as much as you would see in the U.S.
Now, the U.S. certainly is the predominant leader when it comes to philanthropic
Private
practices.
giving,
but I think little by little, I mean, the Arab world, for one, is slowly starting to come up to par. I mean, there's a greater understanding of what strategic philanthropy is. In Africa, you have people like Aliko Dangote, you have Patrice Motsepe, who are all part of the Giving Pledge of Bill Gates. And our founder and CEO was the first Arab-based CEO who joined the Giving Pledge of Bill Gates. So there's Carlos Ghosn in Latin America, not Carlos Ghosn, Carlos Slim. So I think there is a growing understanding of what strategic philanthropy is. And again, whether they're philanthropic activities or foundations, I think it's also due to a generational change now, where we're seeing a massive impact on our way of thinking, I think, because of these young people, these millennials, who are coming with a new set of values and a new set of expectations of how they would like to see this world evolve. And they're taking over a lot of the first-generation decision-making processes in these organizations. So that is having a positive impact on philanthropy and growth markets.
So we're almost out of time. We want to go on to questions for the audience. But the very last question, just quickly. We were talking before and we were discussing this. What do you think that urbanization is required for sustainable growth? I mean, I was giving the example of China, obviously, where I live, where the Financial Times believes that we've reached the tipping point where you no longer have huge floods of rural migrants coming into the cities to work in the factories. So we believe it's leveling off and probably going to decline. And if you look at Beijing, for example, every year for the last 12 years, 450,000 to 500,000 net migration into the city. So, just a massive flood of humanity and not enough water, not enough resources to sustain that, but very fast growth rate. So, I mean, maybe Rolf, looking at other parts of the world and the experiences, is if you don't have that rapid urbanization, can you still grow quickly in these cities?
Well, Jamil, I'd say, the OECD is a very well-known forecasting organization for economic and social development. We don't get it always right, but we have just published a report which is called the Metropolitan Century. And actually, I think that's the forecast that will stand the test of time. There will be no way that when you see the movement these days, not so much in the developed world, because their urbanization is basically already over. Slow, some growth, not much, not last, because aging and demographics speak against large movements in people. But in countries like China, massive, and it will go there. But it will also be not a smooth ride, that's for sure, because the speed and the massive movement that is underway will obviously create a few hiccups. And no surprise, if you look at the history of cities, it's an 8,000 years story, 8,000. And now we're talking about 100 years at the end. That is an acceleration and a way of facing serious challenges that will be on that way. And I'll just want to say, we are talking here yesterday and today we're talking about livable cities, which has a quality dimension to it. Now we want to be happy citizens, basically, people who have a nice environment. It took an enormous time to get there, everywhere. I live in Paris. You walk some of the streets, they are 500 years old. And it's still the same streets. And now we want to do this in a large part of the world in 100 years. All of this done to the same extent? I doubt it. But urbanization, not necessarily in the quality that we would like to see it, will take place. And it will take a massive cooperation between the private sector and government to get that right. For the countries and the cities in the OECD countries, I would say, nourish the cities well, because they will be, as they are already, an asset of competitiveness. An asset of competitiveness, which will be determining a lot of what happens on the countries, at the national level as well.
Okay. Cities are richer than countries.
Not all of them.
No, well, not all of them.
Not all of them.
No, but I mean, what we're seeing is in the markets we're investing in is that often the cities are growing at twice the rate of the actual country itself. I mean, I'm sure Mark must have when you're looking at your strategy, you're looking at very much at a city-based strategy as well. So urbanization I think is linked to prosperity. If we were to make a sort of a categorical statement, McKinsey came out with a research that said a 20% urbanization rate doubles per capita income. But the problem again that you get when you look at it from a growth markets perspective is that that doubling of per capita income also creates changing life habits. And now we're seeing a rise of non-communicable diseases like diabetes and other diseases of that sort because people's lifestyles are changing. So whereas we've uplifted half of the population out of poverty over the last 15 years, what's interesting is that this urbanization rate, which is creating more prosperity in the cities and urbanization, is actually creating a health burden and a disease burden in many of these cities. So that's something we've got to be looking at also from both a challenge perspective but an investment perspective.
Sure. Now I want to give a chance to the audience to ask some questions. So yeah, first question. Do we have a microphone? Yeah, thank you.
Syracuse Hale, I'd like to circle back to your question and ask Professor Yuan the question about urbanization in China. China's urbanization without parallel and created economic growth without parallel in the world history. But now is there a new model that's emerging, given economic constraints, the magnet that the cities were for jobs, but particularly for human services such as healthcare? Is there a new plan, a new model for the second, third, and fourth tier cities and to have people remain in agricultural areas as well? Thank you.
Very good question. Actually, I think Jamil is much better than I do. I teach international relations at the university, and I don't know China that well, but I have to, and I don't know what international relation is. But I think you touch upon extremely important issue. This kind of urbanization. It's very much in human nature. Why over generation want to settle down in the cities instead of rural areas? But in China, I always watching with strong interests. These people from a rural area, now I don't know the accurate statistics, Jamil, is that 300 million already or over the 30 years immigrate from rural area
Right
to
now there's about 280 million migrant workers who've moved into the cities. So,
and I try to follow this chain. I think because it's such a big population, and like all of a sudden, all these people were released from their homeland and rush into big cities and middle-sized cities, and broke sort of a balance, and also brought up a lot of opportunities, but a lot of problems. So I always think it's sort of a dilemma. And certainly, I think there are something inside these people, and I put that as an identity issue. Who I am. When they left this countryside, the rural areas, they went to the cities, trying very hard to find jobs, try to settle down. But inside, are they satisfied? What are they thinking about their children? These generation, let me say, put this way, if the open door or reform started just 35 years ago, then these people already reached to like in the 50s, and their children, young people, what are they thinking? They are already settled like as a citizens in Beijing, in Shanghai, they really feel they already merge into the society, or they still regard themselves sort of outsiders. And I mentioned the sense of land. Those people already find jobs in Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, wherever. They still have piece of land at home. I don't know the concrete statistics, but I do know many of them still spend their saving, life saving, very hard money they earn from the cities to build houses at home. I asked around, some of I have friends, I said, what's the use of your whole house in the rural areas, the public facilities, it's not ready yet, even road. But they said, at least I have a house. We have a house. So, like yesterday, Han Paulson mentioned the faith issue. And when he talked about the faith issue or faith, all those sort of spiritual things, I couldn't help thinking, my people at home, this kind of a spiritual, who I am, who we are, these things sometimes, it seems to me, much more important. I agree with you. Much more important than those like materially. Of course, both are important. But I think for the future, and I think about their children, children's children, how can they really build up a very solid identity, which will be very positive for themselves? I'll stop here.
I'll just give a couple of small supplementary things, statistics. So in many places we've looked at, in southwest China in particular, in many counties you'll find 60% of the income is internal remittances from migrant workers who've gone to the cities and they're sending back their money. And so these are places with agricultural economies and nothing else, and incomes are coming from remittances. And on the point of land, I think it's so important. If you're trying to understand the development of the Chinese economy, to understand that people are still tied to the land. They move into the city, but they keep the piece of land. And that, in a way, is Chinese officials will say this is one of the genius things that the Communist Party has done, is by making them unable to sell their land, basically. What you don't get in China is what you see in Indonesia, Brazil, India, massive slums of landless farmers who've lost their land, moved into the city, and are going to be always poor for generation after generation. Now, the counter to that is that Chinese peasant farmers will have to go back to their land eventually. So migration in China urbanization is kind of reversible, and with lots of implications. But you do not see massive slums of people who will always be slum dwellers and will be pass it on for generations. They'll go back to their pastoral tranquility eventually, which is, I mean, it's a different model, but it's fascinating to see the pros and cons of that. So I'll, yeah.
Hi, Lynn Osmond. I would love to hear, we talked about a handful of growth economies, and I'd love to hear from our two corporate representatives. What are some of the other growth markets that you're looking at? And also, I haven't heard anybody say anything about Africa, and I'd be curious where that stands in the mix. Thank you.
Well, I guess I would say Africa, there are a number of both leisure destinations, and it's mostly in East Africa, where there's now more and more development going on. And commercial centers, it's really been concentrated in Nigeria and South Africa. I think over time it'll start to evolve in some of the other countries. I'm talking about sub-Saharan Africa. Northern Africa is a whole different set of issues. One interesting market that, as an American looking at it, which I think is going to be an enormous growth market, is Cuba. If we have an opportunity to actually get into the market. But no, there have been some tremendous success stories. I think Colombia was talked about yesterday. Both Bogota and I think Medellin were talked about as models in some ways. but Colombia has been incredible. Chile has gone through some cycles based on energy supply and so forth, but it's a highly stable environment. Brazil's obviously having a tough time right now, but future I think will be good. But there are a number of other places. I think there are a number of economies in Southeast Asia. I think actually post-election, Indonesia, actually you mentioned Surabaya, it has got more upside than downside, I think, and we're seeing more and more development there. So just to name a few places.
We don't invest in BRIC countries, so we're sort of an ex-BRIC investor. In Latin America, we're very supportive of the Pacific Alliance countries, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, who together represent the same size as Brazil and are growing at twice the speed right now. In Africa, the FT announced about a month ago that we finished raising a $1 billion fund to invest into Africa. We've already got about 50 companies, 50 investments in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. So we now have that quantum of money to deploy. Again, just to bring on another perspective, I believe that Egypt and many of the Arab Spring countries are going to continue to be very interesting markets. We just listed 2 weeks ago on the London Stock Exchange an Egyptian diagnostics medical company that we invested in before the revolution. It grew at 20% per annum during the revolution, and it was 11 times oversubscribed a few weeks ago when we listed on the London Stock Exchange. So, the thesis that we have always is to look at the micro when you're looking at investing, not to be carried away by the headlines. Because at the end of the day, when you're the mother of 2 children and you're going to the supermarket to buy milk, you don't care who the prime minister is.
Sounds like a marketing slogan.
Could I make one comment on this question here?
Sure, we've got 2 minutes left, so very quickly.
I just want to say that's a very, very pertinent observation that when we talk about urbanization, everybody has the focus very much on China because it's just so massive. But there is a lot of things going on in other countries. Would still say the fact that when you think about, since we're here talking about global cities, if you think about a global city in the continent of Africa, what comes to mind? In reality, maximum 3 cities. It's Cairo, certainly South Africa, and
Johannesburg.
you couldn't say, what is it? What would it say? Cape Town, you would say, perhaps?
Johannesburg.
Johannesburg.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe
This conglomerate there in the middle, and probably, if at all, what would it be? Perhaps in Nigeria, I would say that's probably Lagos. Come there. And I am underlining that because this shows how complicated it will be for Africa as a continent to come out of the shadow, despite all its richness, its resources, its capacities. But it has a delay in this urban development, which may be very expensive in the long run. So it's a very much an issue of the competitiveness.
So Fred has to get a flight. I don't want to hold him up.
Thanks for blaming me.
Yeah, sorry. But I wanted to, there was one other question, maybe very quickly. Was there another question or that they've given up? Good. Oh, they're right there, sorry. Very quick.
Dale Lehman, what contingency plans do you have for your investments in the face of accelerating climate warming or climate disruption, which currently it's 91 degrees in Alaska, and the permafrost is looking for a new name, and there's quite serious concern about destabilization of the methane stores up there and its near-term impact. Thank you.
Do you want to take that?
Well, I gave the example of, when we invest, we look at the environment will turn away any kind of from an investment that is detrimental to the environment, or if we see that we can't create an upside and change that perspective. We are looking at the renewable space a lot as an investor in order to play a role in growing that field. Today, making sure that our investors expect that we're going to invest their money in an ethical way, in a responsible way. And that means taking the environmental issues into concern. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I think the next panel will address the topic in a better way. But I'd like to just really thank our distinguished panel. Thank you all for making my job really easy. And I really enjoyed it. It was a good discussion. And thank you all for listening and for being such a good audience. And
well, thank you very much to our panel for an excellent discussion. We will take a brief 15-minute break and we'll reconvene in here at 3:30 p.m. to discuss scarcity of resources.